Welcome to the GovDiscovery AI podcast with Mike Shanley, your source for actionable insight into government markets and foreign policy. GovDiscovery AI leverages a decade of experience winning federal funding to deliver intel to sales, proposal, and capture teams working in defense and civilian markets. Now here's your host, Mike Shanley.
Welcome to the GovDiscovery AI podcast. Excited today to have our guest, Peter Battaglia, Deputy Director, Mission Assurance Division at the Defense Logistics Agency. Peter, thank you for being on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you very much. It's an honor and privilege to talk to you and the audience.
Well, Peter, let's get started where I didn't expect the conversation to start, but with paper prices. How do paper prices play a role in your work at DLA?
Indeed. So this is a relatively fascinating story. So everyone knows, of course, that we went into COVID and paper started dropping. What not a lot of people understand, though, is that when we came out of COVID, paper actually tripled in price. Where you might have spent $10 on a ream of paper, you were spending sometimes $30 to $50 a ream. And so supply chain examination revealed a couple different factors into that. One is, of course, the demand, right? As we went into COVID, demand dropped, so prices dropped. When we came out, demand increased. But just like Paul Harvey, there's the rest of the story. Part of it was during COVID, with the lower demand, a lot of the paper mills actually switched from producing paper to producing packaging goods. And that was accomplished through the free money through the various COVID acts. Then, so you have reduced supplier availability. Then two other things happen. One is effectively all of Canada caught on fire, which is where a lot of the paper pulp or the wood pulp comes from to manufacture our paper. The second, oddly enough, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What happened there is Europe had largely outsourced their paper mills to Russia for various reasons, economic as well as environmental. So when Russia invaded Ukraine and Europe largely cut off relations with Russian production and Russian economics, they ended up cutting off their own paper supply. And so Europe turned to the United States and Northern America and said, hey, would you provide us our paper? So not only have we decreased production capacity, we've nearly doubled the demand from historic norms, plus there is a shortage of raw materials. So all three of those ended up creating this fascinating effect where you tripled, sometimes quadrupled the price of paper.
So given that example, how do you all at DLA test the surge capacity of the industrial base?
Yeah, and so one of the interesting points there, of course, is that's a very interesting story. But just like you're saying, if you can't identify how to test for these things, be it resiliency, be it actual capacity, it's largely just an interesting story. So DLA is taking an approach where not only are we, doing the contracting for surge capacity, the ability to, say, double or triple the production lines, we're also using emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence to both model and simulate and see what those are. There are a few problems with, the actual testing of logistics capacity, though, right? So if you contract for something, it's, it kind of goes to that Seinfeld episode. It's easy to take a reservation. The value is holding the reservation. Similarly, in logistics, that surge capacity, how do you actually test it? I mean, the inherent problems with surge capacity, one is it's going to be normally beyond the typical demand. So what do you do with the extra material or services produced? How do you actually stand up a temporary production line? How do you validate that? And so we're taking an approach of both on-site testing, where we go and we make sure that, say, they are able to stand up a third production line, meaning they have the personnel, they can show the rosters, they can show that they're able to physically show up on site. We're also looking at does their machinery actually work? So we'll have them rotate between various production lines to make sure that all of it is operational, up to date on maintenance. And then, of course, what I was saying before is we're using some technology, developing those models and simulations to be able to see what the possibilities are.
Moving bigger picture at DLA, what are the priorities and initiatives that you all are focused on as we get ready to move into FY26?
Certainly. And, a lot of people are talking about Secretary Hegseth's, priorities, restoring the warrior ethos, rebuilding our military, reestablishing deterrence. And what a lot of people should realize is that DLA is a combat logistics support agency, or actually a combat support agency for logistics. And what that really means is that DLA is essential to all of those priorities. We're restoring the warrior ethos by building trust, not only within the Department of Defense, but also with industry. We're rebuilding our military. I mean, think about it. All of the industrial base is actually providing the goods and services that our military uses. So anytime that we can increase the capacity, increase the resilience there, we are also supporting the warfighter. Now, what DLA has done is our director has released a new strategic plan covering the years of 2025 to 2030, which is really DLA a transformation, a call to arms. And that's focusing on a couple different things. Most importantly, people, which is building our organizational agility through not only our people, but our culture. Again, referring back to Secretary Hegseth's priorities. Our precision. How do we actually calibrate resilient and responsive logistics throughout? And again, that's our central role as a combat support agency. Posture is our third P, which is enhancing our support to deterrence by having material available in the correct location at the correct time. And finally, not the least of which, is our partnerships. Not only are we working and partnering with the industrial base in order to provide more resilient supply chains, we're also partnering with allies as well as with industry to make sure that of that interoperability and that mutual support framework.
So could we get into a couple of those things a little bit more? One, on the industrial base, is one of the priorities growing that, bringing in, probably increasing the capacity of existing partners, but also bringing in new partners to that industrial base? I'd be interested in your thinking along those lines.
Certainly. And so the industrial base is critical to DLA. Not only is it where we are sourcing the material, but it's actually the material that's allowing us to support all of those priorities. And so actually, let me take a step back here for a second and explain my role as mission assurance and how supply chain risk management fits into that. So my job is basically to assure that DLA is able to operate in any given condition. It could be a great day where everything's operating perfectly. We've all had those computer hiccups that, cause systems to go down. We, could lose communications. Maybe cell goes out or there's an active attack. But that entire spectrum of events, from a really good day to the really bad day, my job is to make sure that DLA is able to operate in that continuum. But DLA, of course, is a support provider interfacing with the industrial base. If the industrial base is not able to produce the goods and services that the warfighter requires, I don't want to say it this way, but largely DLA can stay at home. Because if that supply chain breaks and we don't have the resiliency to assure that those supplies and services are moving forward, then kind of why do you have DLA? So again, we're partnering with the industrial base, trying to make sure that it's healthy and responsive, trying to make sure that DLA is doing the appropriate things in terms of not only managing technical specifications, but working with industry to ensure that they understand the requirements. What is needed now, what may be needed in the future, and how do we partner in order to provide that?
You touched on AI. I'm interested to go a little bit deeper on what is your thinking? How are you approaching that conversation in terms of where that is going to be valuable and integrating into your processes?
Excellent question. And that's, AI is a very popular discussion point right now between Chat GPT and everything. And of course, we're using the various large language models, things along those lines, to help us write with more clarity, to be able to automate some of those small tasks. But really what we're designing our AI use for is decision advantage. Basically, it's helping us tie all of those authoritative data sources together so that we can get that full picture. Just like when I was telling the story about paper price increase, right? We are taking all of the data sets and integrating them so that we can have that complete story visualization, not just data visualization. But that actually reminds me of another story, one that people need to be cognizant of. First, let me tell you that George Box is one of my favorite people in the world. He is an economist. My favorite quote from him is actually, "All models are wrong, some are useful." And so that not only folds into the story, but everything that we're discussing here. And so it's actually a fascinating story about Planet X. You remember where back in the day, in the 80s and 90s, people were fascinated that we were going to have a 10th planet, right? So when you're looking through the story of that, one, Newtonian, gravity models came up, and I think it was Neptune that it first predicted based off of the orbit, deviations and things. And so they found it, and they said, "Hey, look, there's another planet." And then they were analyzing that. They found further discrepancies in the model. And they ended up saying, okay, if there is another planet, where should we look? So they manually compiled all of that data and found out the location in the sky and looked there at a certain date and time. Sure enough, there was another planet. And everyone got really excited. And they were looking through the data and, again, doing all of the manual calculations. And according to the data, there should be another planet out there. And that actually drove the search for Planet X or Planet 10. And so they spent years, decades even, looking for this planet, trying to figure out where it was. And then I think it was in the 90s, they looked, they reviewed all of the data, and they realized that the Naval Observatory hadn't correctly done maintenance and acknowledged that their data fields were off. Once you purified that data and took away that element, all the computations went, boom, there are no more planets. And the search for Planet X died that day, which is great because that allowed us to use resources for other things. The lesson out of that, though, is just because you have data to feed into your artificial intelligence, unless you are sure of that data, unless you have the purity, the standardization, everything along those lines, you might get out of artificial intelligence the existence of Planet X. But you can both use AI to not only run those models, but make sure that those data elements are appropriate and whether or not they're aligning.
Well, when we're talking about the unpredictability of these events, you're talking about the 80s. We're looking for a 10th planet. Who would have thought actually we're going to go down to 8 planets from there? I'm thinking of the Mark Twain quote. I just pulled it up here. It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so.
Yep.
So just understanding that uncertainty there. Peter, moving along to the allied, engaging with the allies.
Mm-hmm.
I want to touch briefly on the foreign ownership, control, and influence. Could you talk a little bit about how that plays a role in DLA's work? And then I'd like to move into talking a bit more about the NATO partners and how to best engage those industrial bases.
Certainly. So what's commonly known as FOCI, foreign ownership, control, and influence. That is one of the 12 risk areas that DLA, or actually all of the department, is looking at. And really what that boils down to is kind of, in terms of that industrial-based participant, right, the producer of X material, who actually owns them? Who controls them? Who is, protecting their data sources? And really that examination is looking to try and determine what are the risks involved with using a specific supplier. And of course, we want to use American industrial base, American owned companies, but we recognize that this is a global supply chain throughout almost everything. So who actually owns the company? Who has the influence over it? You might remember just recently, U.S. Steel went up for sale, right? And so that was a large portion of the industrial base for steel production within the United States. And of course, there were various proposers in terms of who was going to buy it and how it was going to settle out. One of the things that you don't want to have happen is losing control of your own industrial base. So you have these CFIUS cases, which are examining the foci and figuring out whether or not, say, Nippon Steel out of Japan is actually, should they buy U.S. steel and be able to control and dictate those plants? And of course, everyone's familiar with how that ended up, which I think is a benefit to steel overall. But again, those are the sorts of things that we're looking at. And then, of course, as you tied in, there's differences between, say, potentially adversarial countries versus our allies, right? So, of course, I hope most people know of AUKUS. Those sorts of allied partnerships really allow for information sharing as well as potential logistics support. And so one of the things that we're looking at, because we realize that these are all global supply chains and things go from continent to continent and country to country, how do we actually share the information that we have and leverage that with their information for a complete site picture and potential mutual support?
Could you get into a bit more on the how for that? Talking about the what are the ways that DLA can do that, either with AUKUS or with other NATO partners, and maybe talk a bit about the regional sustainment framework.
Excellent. Yes, and so we DLA have a couple of avenues. One, of course, is through the formal AUKUS agreements, NATO, things along those lines, mutual support treaties. And those are very formal, defined through either DoD or Department of State methods of communication and data sharing. However, we're also exploring things like the UK Terms of Reference, which is a DLA-specific agreement with the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense. And that is aimed at how do we share the information so that we can mutually support each other. And one example of that is, as you referenced, the regional sustainment framework. And so large picture, that is basically how do we conduct things such as maintenance, repair operations, what's called MRO, as well as logistics, supply, interoperability. Sorry, a little bit of a tongue twister there. Interoperability. How do those come together, and how do we mutually support each other? I guess, I'm a little bit of a story. Again, back to George Box, all mottos are wrong, some are useful, but you've probably taken a long distance car trip, right? And so
several.
Yeah, and as you're driving along, if you ever encounter, vehicle difficulty, right? Say I'm in Northern Virginia. If I'm driving out in California, I don't want to have to bring my vehicle all the way back to Virginia out of California in order to repair it. And I'd much rather use that, repair shop in California. And so, of course, I should do my due diligence, make sure that they're certified, make sure that they're using the proper parts. But once you do those sorts of things, why not have that maintenance done there? And so that's, a little bit of a different concept, a little different execution, so to speak, when you're talking about like an F-16 or an F-35, something along those lines. But the concept's effectively the same. How do you partner with those allies in that allied industrial base in order to make sure that your weapon system has, minimal downtime, that you're able to use it for its missions? Again, make sure that your military is operational and you can enact that deterrence as fast as possible. And that's really what the regional sustainment framework is. And so DLA is part of that, not only by the information sharing, right, but as well as our logistics support agreements with other allies and their capabilities, such as NATO, right? I believe it's the NATO Sustainment Procurement Activity, NISPA. So we have various things such as the NATO Logistics Exchange that allows us to potentially source parts from them, and they can as well source parts from us in order to maintain those deterrence capabilities.
Yeah, there's recently a briefing from a senior Canadian official talking about that from the other side, the importance of being able to repair in a joint mission, to repair each other's equipment. Moving on, Peter, to critical minerals. That comes up in, I'd say, every event we're at, every conversation, not just DLA, but everywhere across DoD. I'm interested in your perspective. How do you all think about that in terms of the role that critical minerals and materials play in your operations?
Certainly. So, of course, the first thing that we have is for critical minerals, critical materials, what are they actually? Because, everyone always defaults to the rare earth elements, right? That's kind of the default topic. And don't get me wrong, those are very important. You have very critical capabilities enabled by that. But similarly to that, right, for almost any computer chip, you need the silicon wafer. And there are only a few sources of supply of that silicon material of high enough purity that you can actually make those wafers for the advanced chips and everything. So first off is working through the definition of what is a critical material. And then second is making sure that you understand that supply chain. What are the risks and vulnerabilities associated with that? Just like the paper example, right? And unless you know that, hey, we're sourcing a lot of our wood pulp from Canada and Europe has largely, offshored their capabilities to Russia. You wouldn't know that resultant surge in demand would be caused by those things. And so you need to really understand the picture of what is the sourcing and supply chain. And then, of course, the ultimate question of what do you do about it? And so DLA has a few different avenues there. Of course, one, you can always increase the final product that uses it, right? You can get a big warehouse and store up a bunch of extra computer chips and everything. But that carries a lot of inventory costs, handling costs, kind of what's driving you in the efficiency lane more towards a just in time instead of a just right, or just in case scenario. And so what we're looking at is a few different things. We can do things like a war stopper investment, which is a specific program that allows us to either procure final material or intermediate material, say batteries, right? There's cells that operate, and the shelf life for a battery really doesn't start until you make the final connection between those cells. So if you just hold a bunch of the cells independently, you can kind of store them forever. Not really, but kind of store them forever on the shelf and then make that final connection and have an operational battery. So that's part of what we're doing through the War Stopper program, making those investments. And then, of course, everyone's favorite, the National Defense Stockpile, which is geared actually more than just the Department of Defense. It's actually geared towards the entire industrial base. And so they make various investments into those materials, have the large stockpiles available in case we need to break the glass and start shipping, that sort of thing. And so there's various investment and partnership opportunities throughout. And DLA is participating by helping the Department of Defense understand what those supply chains are, understand what the demands on those supply chains are, and how can we best make those investment decisions.
Well, with that, as we're moving towards the end, let's talk about industry and industry associations. What is your advice or suggestions, or what would you say to them on how they can best support DLA's mission?
I'll go back to the aspect of trust, right? And so trust is essential in any sort of partnership. It's essential in being able to understand and actually employ any decision sets. And where I really see the advantage of the industrial associations or the consortiums, or pick your nom de jour, so to speak, of whatever conglomeration, that is a great avenue for that trust building. I would ask that, more of those forums encourage government speakers, encourage sharing. What are we actually intending? How do we share that data? And of course, with us providing data, information, and idea, I'd also ask that those forums do the same. Gather up what is their industry expecting? What are the problems that they're facing? A lot of discussion right now. How do we encourage the industrial base to share what their supply chains are, where their sources of supply? Well, one thing that we could always use help in understanding is what actually would be encouraging to the industrial base. Again, George Box, parents and children, right? You're always trying to help raise your children and get to the best that they can be. But part of that is having that mutual understanding of, okay, what's actually going to encourage the child? And you have the theoretics, right? Oh, all children like candy. Well, okay, that might be generally true, but I know my kid actually hates Twizzlers. So if I tried to get them to, do something by giving them Twizzlers, that's not going to work at all. And so those consortiums, trade partners, groups, those sorts of things, I'd ask them, what actually would encourage your industrial base? Where do they need assistance? How can we mutually develop plans and programs in order to not only minimize risk, and maximize resilience, but what are those elements that are going to help each other that we can use to build and progress further into the future?
I appreciate that. And in these events too, that's what we always encourage and support is those human connections. We are a AI company, a human in the loop AI company that we deliver market intelligence to the business development, the capture teams going after the DoD pursuits, but it's that human piece that is the most important. Having that lead, that human expertise, knowing how to align talking points or solutioning with what DLA or with what DoD is looking for. So I appreciate hearing that building those human connections in person, conferences are probably one of the better ways to do it.
Yes.
Is really, I think, probably one of the most important roles that the industry associations can be playing right now. With that, Peter, what's the so what that you would leave for the DoD industrial base as we wrap up at least this conversation?
Yeah, and so there's a few different things that I'd leave here. One is the industrial base is absolutely essential for anything that DLA wants to accomplish and for the capabilities of our warfighter. Again, without the industrial base, we wouldn't have our effective military. We wouldn't be able to have that deterrence. So again, we need that partnership. How do we build that? How do we progress into the future to maximize the deterrence and the readiness of our military? And so what I would ask people, if you don't mind, is actually make sure that they're going to our website, DLA.mil. Make sure that they're going into our strategic plan, DLA Transforms, a call to action, which is available on our website, because that will help you understand some of the initiatives and programs that we're going through and what ultimately we're trying to achieve in this 5-year time frame.
Yes, that's DLA.mil for the homepage, and the DLA Strategic Plan 2025 to 2030. Quick web search will bring you right to that where you can download the full PDF. Peter, with that, thank you for taking some time out of your day to share your insight and thoughts with our audience, with industry and your colleagues in government. Very much appreciate you being on the show and look forward to staying in touch, hopefully to have you back maybe in a couple months or in early FY26.
All right. Thank you very much and look forward to any future engagements we have.
Thank you, Peter. Have a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to the GovDiscovery AI podcast with Mike Shanley. GovDiscovery AI leverages our team's decade of experience winning federal funding to deliver federal growth intel to sales, proposal, and capture teams working in defense and civilian markets. Each market intel report is delivered by federal growth experts leveraging our proprietary deep data discovery process. If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and connect with GovDiscovery AI and Mike Shanley on LinkedIn, or learn more at govdiscoveryai.com.